This is Brad Gillespie. I'm Chief Marketing Officer for Octiv. Today we're going to be covering the topic of how to use sales enablement throughout the buyer's journey. We're going to be doing this by talking about the case study of our client, Game Time. Game Time is a unique client in that they're a near 100-year-old company that is doing some very proactive and innovative things with enabling sellers across the buyer's journey. First, let me set up the concept of the buyer's journey and compare and contrast this to the way that most of us think today as the sales process. The sales process, or the selling cycle, is essentially the seller's typical viewpoint of advancing a prospect through the stages of awareness and education, qualification, identifying the right solution to meet the client's needs, demonstrating value required to compel the client or buyer to buy, proposing the specific solution, and then making the close. The problem with this mentality is that the buying environment, the buyer's journey, has changed significantly over the past 5 to 10 years, as most of us know. Buyers are much more empowered, they're much more educated than ever before. They have access to information that beforehand only the seller could share with the buyer, but today that information is widely available on the internet. Buyers can talk to other buyers can talk to their peers, buyers can access analyst information. And so the very first interaction that a buyer and seller have, the challenge is now on the seller to add value in a much more quick to consume type of horizon. And so if we think about this same process through the eyes of the buyer, what the buyer is attempting to do is make a decision to buy. And our role as marketing and sales is to really help the buyer through that journey of making the right decision. And so the steps that we would think about if we were thinking through that lens are quite a bit different. Loosening the status quo is really the first job that we need to think about along the buyer's journey. What will compel an organization, an institution, or an individual buyer to consider a new solution or a new way of doing things that aligns with your product or service? The second step that I have to make as a buyer is to make an internal commitment to some degree of change. I don't know yet at this point in my journey how much change I'm going to make or what that change is going to look like necessarily, but at this point I've at the very least committed to doing some degree of change. That leads me to explore all of the possibilities that are available to me. And as we all know, for most buyers in most industries, there are more options and alternatives today than ever before. We have a very competitive selling environment, and buyers know this. So buyers understand that they have options, and when they explore those options, they are looking for help from the seller and the seller organization to do that. If that step is successful, the next step in my journey as a buyer is to make a firm commitment to a solution. That commitment to a solution can take days, weeks, months, quarters, and in some cases even years to make that transition from exploring solutions to the actual decision being made. So that committing to a solution part of the process of the buyer's journey is extremely important and oftentimes very difficult. So we have to, again, fulfill a need that the buyer has to help them make the right decision for their business, because the next step is a lot of internal selling that typically the buyer has to undertake within their organization to justify the decision. They have to justify the level of effort required, the level of change required to implement the solution and see value from the solution. They may have to justify the budget even further, even though that budget may have been available and approved for this type of purchase. We still have to go back and justify that decision. And again, as thinking about the buyer, our role here is to help the buyer along this step of the journey. And then last but not least is that actual decision where selection and ownership happens, and then the relationship begins to change, where I am no longer a buyer, I'm now a customer. And I've begun my customer journey at the point that I have made my selection and own your solution. So now my expectations as a customer are going to be different for the seller and the seller organization. So hopefully this compares and contrasts the different points of view and how we have traditionally looked at the same process two very different ways. So the reason that this is important is if you adopt this mindset, like many organizations are today, to think of the process as the buyer's journey and the buying cycle, and we think about these steps that we want to help a buyer work through, we will then begin to think of all of the ways that we can enable sales quite a bit differently. And so the scenario that I'm going to walk us through are going to really address a few different layers of this process. The first is, what does the buyer-seller interaction look like? Where does it occur? How does it occur? Does it occur online? Does it occur in a phone interaction? Does it occur in a live event? Does it occur in a face-to-face situation? And at each step of the journey, those interactions may be different. We need to understand what each of those interactions look like. Next, what content and tools do we as sellers, as well as just the broader market, make available to the buyer? So what resources does the buyer have available to help them through their process at each step of the buyer's journey? On the other side of that coin, what content, tools, and coaching do we make available to our sellers, to our sales team, and how are we enabling them through content, tools, and coaching? And then lastly, what are the tools and systems that the seller uses to power all of the above? So the case that we're going to look at a bit goes back to our client Game Time. And what you're looking at is essentially a grid that combines the two axes of the buyer's journey across the top and all of the layers of sales enablement support that we need to think through on the vertical axis, from interactions, buyer content, seller content, tools and systems. So I would encourage you, as you are thinking about your own environment, to do a mapping exercise that asks the questions for each step in the buyer's journey. What do the interactions between buyer and seller look like? What does the buyer have available to them at each step along the journey to help them make their decision? What content are we making available to our sellers to enable them to do their job better in helping the buyer buy and helping the buyer along each step of the buyer's journey? And then what tools and systems, therefore, are required to power all of that? So for a more detailed deep dive of this scenario, we're going to provide an on-demand recording of a webcast that I did along with our clients at Game Time to go into more detail. But for today, I'll just highlight a few that I think are interesting. Now think back to Game Time's business model. They're selling playground equipment to mostly municipal and other government entities. And the biggest challenge that they have, as you might expect, is how do we get a government buyer to loosen the status quo, be curious about what's available and possible in the category of playground equipment. And the challenge that Game Time took up and really thought about was, how do we demonstrate innovation and how far the product has come in playground and recreation equipment over the decades? How has safety evolved? How can we meet regulation and regulatory requirements that you have for this type of equipment? And that's a very major hurdle that Game Time thought quite a bit about. And you'll see here in this step that the interactions between buyers and sellers primarily happen two different ways. They happen online, so the seller can go and search for available options, and these are also largely driven based on field events such as trade shows. Another few that I'll highlight in this grid of requirements are the content that is made available to the buyer. And one of those areas that I hinted at, that as an older, more established company where Game Time is doing things in a very innovative way, is how they are using rich media to help convey the vision of what's possible for a potential buyer of playground equipment. One of our roles as sales and marketing is to help the buyer understand what's possible, the art of the possible. And a good way to do that in this situation, as Game Time discovered, was to create digital renderings as well as things like drone shot video of either a simulated installation that represents what the buyer is interested in achieving their buying vision, as well as very similar implementations and installations of similar playgrounds and other areas. And so being able to provide this content that makes it come to life, the vision come to life for the buyer, has been very effective as Game Time has helped the buyer along the journey. If you contrast that to the fact that these are government entities that are making the purchase, there's this huge requirement to have documentation of everything. And so in contrast to the rich media formats that help the product come alive, Game Time still has to meet some requirements for delivering information to procurement offices based on those guidelines. So that typically means printed versions of almost all documentation that has to be put into a binder and delivered in hard copy format to the buyer. So you have this very interesting mix of very rich, interactive, modern media and old school document-based paper binders with the same level of information. And then lastly, obviously the tools and systems are essential to this. What we know is the seller's burden today is higher than it's ever been. We have to look for ways as business leaders to take some of that burden and simplify the selling experience for our sellers. That means giving them the right tools to do the right aspect of the job across the buyer's journey. I'll also mention that one of the things that Game Time has done extremely well is their approach to ongoing field enablement and training. Rather than doing this at just one point in the life cycle of a salesperson, perhaps at hiring and onboarding, Game Time has adopted a very sustained, programmatic approach to field-based training that is done routinely. So a few action items that we might consider as we start our journey. The first step that I would encourage you all to do is to conduct a mapping exercise very similar to what you saw kind of revealed in that completed grid, with those few purposes in mind. Understand what the buyer is doing at each step of the buyer's journey to take the next step. Understand what their requirements for content are. Understand the types of interactions that they prefer to have, and map that out. And when you map that out for a few different recent sales efforts, you'll begin to see some things that you can take some action on. The second is with respect to content. You're going to see that you need to create some content that may not exist, or create better versions of content that exists today. This requires a very focused effort to get the job done. And while you're doing that, you need to think across all the platforms, as in the case of Game Time, where they had to create content for both very interactive, rich media purposes as well as document-based purposes. Try to be as consistent as possible in delivering the same message with the same level of detail across all platforms and requirements. And then that approach to ongoing training and onboarding. Game Time's lesson that they would share is that this is going to take longer than you think, so plan for more time and likely more expense than you think. So these are three of probably many really good action items that you could begin to take today if the buyer's journey and understanding how sales enablement really maps to the buyer's journey is an initiative that's on your set of priorities for the coming year. And again, to get more detail on this project and how Game Time has approached this, we're going to provide a link to an on-demand webcast for more detailed viewing. So thanks for your time and attention today. I do hope you'll check out the on-demand webcast. And as always, if Octiv can be of any support to you in helping establish better practices or drive sales productivity, please reach out to your Octiv relationship or to myself directly. Thanks, and take